Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight in this third webinar in the series, Webinars for Ukraine. Wendy and I will be your hosts again. Wendy is representing World Psychologists Foundation, who offers free mental health care via their huge network of volunteers. Probably some will be here tonight as well, I think. I am from PsyGlobal, and we are trying to connect international psychologists to Dutch mental health care providers in order to ease in access to psychological aid. And this webinar is an initiative, a collaboration between our organizations together with the Friends of Proluki and PsyFlix. And tonight we have a very interesting international guest, and Wendy will introduce her to you in a minute. But before we start, we get a lot of questions from people asking if it's possible to see the webinars afterwards. I already saw some questions popping up in the chat about this. And yes, that is possible. We are recording all the webinars, and if you are a member of PsyFlix, you can see them straight away on the PsyFlix website. And if not, we are going to put them on our own websites as well. And I think this will be done in 2 weeks' time. We're working on it. Furthermore, we like the webinars to be interactive. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A, the Q&A or in the chat. And we will present them to our speaker and also meanwhile, and we have 50 minutes left in the end to have attention for all the questions that are still there. Wendy, will you introduce our speaker?
Yes, of course. Nino, we are very happy that you have time for tonight to have a presentation about youth and trauma. You are from Nino Markashvili. She's from Georgia, from beautiful Tbilisi. And she is very busy. And right now you are in Yerevan, in a hotel in Armenia, to do like a supervision and training course. So it is 10 o'clock in the evening, so probably it will be quite late tonight for you.
It is.
Yes, and so you have a busy schedule. I already told you are a professor in healthcare program and the head of mental health research center, and your focus is psychotrauma, also related to refugees and torture, prisoners and youth. And you also are director of the non-profit organization Foundation Global Initiative on Psychiatry, and that is promoting mental health reforms. And you did already in a lot of countries, Central Asia, a lot of different Azerbaijan, Armenia, and also for a long time you already work in Ukraine and Sri Lanka. You set up there a trauma center. So you are very all around, and that's why we are very happy to listen to you knowledge about the trauma and youth. Did I forget something, Nino?
Mamma mia, no, you're most kind, and
okay.
Thank you for this. Very nice introduction. It is my pleasure and honor to be with you, ladies, to be with you, dear friends that I could not see, but well, I know that you are there.
Yes. Okay, the floor is yours, Nino. If you can share your PowerPoint, if I have to help you, please let me know.
Thank you, Wendy. So today we are going to talk about the youth and trauma, well, let us remind ourselves about the hardships that the youth experience, just to see the burden of the war trauma on their shoulders, and such a huge task is ahead of us to help them to deal with those challenges. But before going into the trauma, let me talk about the mental health. This is the new definition of the mental health that I find pretty nice, operational, where Galderisi and other authors describe mental health as a dynamic state of internal equilibrium, which enables individuals to use their abilities in harmony with universal values of society. Then there is a list of basic cognitive and social skills, ability to recognize, express, modulate one's own emotions, as well as empathize with others, flexibility, and the ability to cope with adverse life events and function in social roles, and harmonious relationship between body and mind represent important components of mental health, which contribute to different degrees to the state of internal equilibrium. So this is, I think this definition pretty well describes what is mental health and how this equilibrium is imbalanced when we have mental health problems, especially in youth, because their equilibrium is pretty, well, it is in the stage of stabilization, so it is pretty vulnerable. And after presenting the definition of mental health, let me present the staging model that guides during the recent years, guides me and my team, for instance, in designing interventions, in conceptualizing how and when we should intervene. I'm sorry, perhaps the model is not that visible. This is the model presented in the paper of Vikram Patel and others in the Lancet journal in 2018. And it just represents the, well, kind of common development of mental health disorder, starting from the asymptomatic stage that we have. These dots are problems. All of us, yeah, all of us have some problems like insomnia, tiredness, irritability, and so on and so forth. So this is asymptomatic phase. Then, if life stressors are kind of coming into our life, then a little bit more symptoms are appearing, and we call that non-specific mental distress. We feel frustrated, we feel uncomfortable, and if we do not do anything, then this symptomatology becomes heavier, and we are then experiencing kind of sub-threshold, sub-syndromal conditions. We are not clinically ill, we don't have mental illness, but we have subclinical manifestations that are pretty well disturbing. And if again we don't do anything, unfortunately, this symptomatology, these syndromes are becoming fully defined syndromes, fully defined disorders like anxiety, like depression, like psychosis. And if it continues down and down, then we have functional impairment, we have a handicap, and so it goes towards the persistent and chronic conditions. So what this model shows us that while we are asymptomatic, we should promote mental health. We should try and have healthy lifestyle, sleep hygiene, physical activity, and so on and so forth. When the stage of non-specific mental distress appears, we should really support ourselves. So we should pay attention, do some self-care techniques, and so on and so forth. we should identify and intervene early when we are having subsyndromal symptom profile. And here a lot of transdiagnostic approaches are effective when we don't have distinct disorder, but we have problems, for instance, emotional disbalance, for instance, lowered mood, irritability. So we could do the programs that address those disturbances. And of course, if we are having the disorders, then we should use the evidence-based treatment. So voice of model is kind of this, that put resources in the promotion and prevention, especially if we just remind ourselves that 21st century is and should be the century where the prevention is the most prevailing value, that we should do cost-effective, effective interventions to prevent disorders. So we should try to identify problems early and intervene early, apply transdiagnostic methods, apply evidence-based treatments when we have disorders, and be recovery-oriented. I will come back to this model at the end of my presentation, but let me now give several slides about the VO and mental health. We know that there is very well documented, not only by WHO, but many systematic review and meta-analysis show us how wars and these military conflicts are damaging our mental health. So 2019, WHO published the data that 1 in every 5 people living in war-affected areas has a mental health problem. So the prevalence is around 22% in war-affected areas. And if we are looking at the pooled prevalence estimates from 17 war-affected countries, we see that 46, around half of children and adolescents have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of, more than 40% have depression, and 27% suffer with anxiety condition. These are pretty high numbers. So why today? Why youth? Why are we talking about the young people? And we consider age 14 until 25, and not just we, WHO also consider young people as a persons between this age range. First of all, this is the age, for instance, adolescence age, that these persons are at high risk of experiencing traumatic events if we are just not talking about the war. Because in addition to the traumatic stressors that are common with adult population, adolescents are at high risk of trauma-related bullying, cyberbullying as well, violence in home, violence in community, especially if the communities are violent. Yeah, they experiment with drugs. They are taking pretty risky behaviors, are appearing in the risky situations, because we know that young brain is not matured enough to clearly see the consequences of the behavior. This age is the age when they are trying to define who they are, and in this course of discovering their identities, their eyes, they engage in risky behavior, power struggles with peers and parents. Their range of emotions is extreme, So this is irritability, this is impulsivity, and so on and so forth. So this is the age-specific, very short description, why the age is vulnerable. If we just also just recall how young age appeared the most vulnerable age because of COVID-19, and you see the data about just suicide and suicidal attempts on the slide, how the attempts and well, percentage in suicides has been increased in European countries because of COVID. And not, this is just about the suicidal attempts and suicide rate, but we know that depression, anxiety, adjustment disorder, and also post-traumatic stress disorder rates were very high in all countries that conducted studies among their young population. So young age plus COVID and the restrictions and isolation and frustration. And if that young person experience trauma experience, then we see even more vulnerability, because trauma experienced by this age group is particularly important, as well as in children, of course, because significant physical, emotional growth is still occurring at this age. We know that brain maturation continues, well, even further than age 24, but still. So the stressors that a person encounters will help to shape his or her growth perspective and could have long-lasting impacts. For instance, adolescence is a time of increased brain development, and there is the evidence that stress associated with traumatic exposure can change major structural components of the brain, but also hormonal system. Unfortunately, we still don't have much research on those changes. So this is the area that still needs exploration, but some evidences already are there. If we just recall what is the trauma and recall types of trauma, we know that type 1 trauma is pretty often in a young age. We know about the traumatic brain injuries in a young age because of cycling, bicycling, motorcycling. We know about other injuries like road accidents and so on and so forth. So type 1 trauma is pretty often happening in that risk-taking group, but type 2 trauma, unfortunately, to the war exposed, protracted conflict exposed youth is even more heavier. We know that type 2 trauma covers the trauma that is repeated, that is long-term, that starts in the young age. And we know how long-lasting impact, well, both types have, but type 2 trauma especially leads to the complex manifestations. Fortunately, we also know that all children and young people exposed to the trauma, they experience this exposure differently, and not all of them are all of them are those who develop the problems. For instance, when we showed when we looked at the slide about the prevalence rate, we see that 50% does not suffer from PTSD, and 60% does not suffer from depression, and 70% is not experiencing clinical anxiety symptomatology. So a lot of them are resilient and are not strongly affected. I do think that all of us, when we are young and war is going on in our homeland, all of us would be affected, but not affected in the clinical way. But many experience significant adverse effects that impact their cognitive, physical, physiological, affective, interpersonal, and behavioral functioning. So what are the common responses following trauma in these persons? And not only in the young age, because young age really covers, well, at least is on the border with child age and with the adulthood. So this is adolescence plus young adult, and unfortunately the range of symptomatology and reactions is pretty wide. So among emotional reactions, we see anxiety and fear, guilty feelings, self-blaming, anger, sadness, denial, helplessness, feeling overwhelmed, and emotional numbness, freezing, dissociation. Among physical reactions, we see a lot of the pains are not here, but they should be. A lot of diffuse pains, itches, sweating, shaking, well, exhaustion, so on and so forth. Cognitive reactions might be also pretty severe, like disorientation and confusion. Sometimes the personalization and the realization, difficulty concentrating, memory problems, increased vigilance, hyper alertness, repetitive thinking about the traumatic event, even if I'm not talking about that. Difficulties with problem solving, and pessimistic outlook on life, being cynical, distrusting others. Unfortunately, everything comes out into the behavioral reactions, conduct patterns, and we see aggressiveness because the young person is irritated by the minor trigger, talking about traumatic event very often, or being silent, withdrawing from family and friends, wanting to spend more time alone. Also, we observe them of being very protective of their family and friends, overprotective. I recall the young person who could not stand to being apart from his mother and brother, and if he was forced to go somewhere, then he tried to be on the phone with them, just to see that they are safe. Of course, regression. We see regression not only in kids, but in this age as well. So returning to younger ways of behaving, including giving up responsibilities, sudden return to the rebellious behavior that should not be there, for instance, in 20 years old young person. Increased need for independence, and this stems from the need of control. self-absorption and caring only about what is immediately important, loss of interest in school, in friends, in hobbies, and in life in general. And we know that this might bring us to the suicidal ideation and planning and attempts. And we also see huge kind of numbers of reenactment behavior. So this is the behavior, repetitive compulsive behavior, that the young person does not, well, it is not conscious behavior that the person applies to his life. And very often, unfortunately, this is pretty risky behavior.
Nina, can I ask you something?
Yes, please.
All these behaviors, is this something you should worry about if you see it, or could it be also like a healthy way of coping? For example, the second one is talking about traumatic events.
Mm-hmm.
Are all these behaviors something that shouldn't be there, or how do you look at this?
Yeah, actually, what I think is that all symptoms are the way of our psyche to cope with the event, with the experience, with the exposure that is incomprehensible, that is too out of normal. So I think that all symptoms are the coping symptoms. Some of them we could find that some of them, for instance, talking, trying to reprocess, trying to comprehend, trying to get over of this event, might be even adaptive coping, but we know that this is the symptom of re-experiencing, talking, also imagining, without much control from your side. So then it becomes disturbing symptom. So what I could tell you is that everything, even here, for instance, we prefer the person to be angry instead of numb and frozen, because anger has the energy, and you could somehow work with this energy. But everything is, for instance, emotional numbness. This is the coping, because the pain is huge, and person should anesthesia, if it's in good English. Persons should not feel the pain. So the psyche, the body, just freezes the emotion. So all symptoms for me are the coping, but unfortunately mostly gone wrong.
Thank you.
Did I answer?
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
So, and if we are talking about mental health outcomes, like symptomatology, this range is also pretty wide, unfortunately. So we see acute stress reactions when the event is acute. We see depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. We see anxiety, we see panic attacks, we see addictions, we see somatic distress, we see ADHD, we see pre-existing difficulties aggravated, and unfortunately we see also psychotic episodes. So a lot of clinical outcomes could be diagnosed. We also see the differences regarding the gender. For instance, some research tells us that the young males display more externalizing behavior, like hostility, aggression, conduct difficulties, delinquent behavior, when females have more internalized behaviors, like more shame, shyness, self-blaming, and so forth. So these gender differences might result in boys, for instance, having more aggressive behaviors than girls, and girls displaying more depression, for instance, than boys. So more recent research supports the idea that stress response may differ between young people, young ladies and young men, on the neurobiological level, with stress responses indexed by cortisol showing different patterns. So the cortisol differently affects the structures like hippocampus in men and women, but still we need more data here as well. What we know is that alas, trauma exposure has short-term and long-term consequences. For instance, the study of former child soldiers found that 50% of the study participants were reporting the worst mental health outcomes 16 years after return to the civilian life. For instance, in Georgia, we saw high levels of depression, anxiety, and PTSD after 20 years of exposure. It might be that not only trauma exposure works that way, but also, for instance, the authors, the Betancourt is a famous lady who has very interesting studies. She and her team suggest that protracted conflict harms the development, of course, but also weakens the healthcare delivery systems. And as this infrastructure and the resources are not available, then of course, if we are recalling the staging model, without any help, the mental state deteriorates further and further. Yeah. And we know the different trajectories, not only in the natural disasters, but also man-made disasters. And we know that it's very, very hard to have the prognosis how these persons' trajectory would be manifested. Could this person recover fully? Yeah, might be. Is it possible that we see this increased severity? Yes. Is it possible that we see the episodes of better and worse well-being? Yes. I think 7, 8 different trajectories are now detected, and it is very hard to say what affects those trajectories. But what we know that cumulative traumatization really is a predictor of worse outcomes. For instance, when we know that moderate levels of stress may result in skill building, may result in a well-equipped individual coping, yeah, frequency of exposure, severity of the exposure traumatic exposure is believed to weaken the processes of resilience. So at some level, some frequency, we are strengthened, we learned how to cope, we are better equipped to adjust. But if the level of the exposure is too severe, our coping strategies are deteriorated. So, and we are weakened. And most studies on war and conflict create an index of trauma by summing the different types of traumatic events experienced throughout the lifetime, like life event scale that lists more than 20 traumatic exposures, and then we see that person is exposed to 3 or 4 or, well, 10 or 16 events, don't we? Though there are researchers who say that, yeah, the cumulative traumatization is a thing, and yeah, we should consider that, but we should also consider classifying different types of exposure, such as direct, indirect, vicious, witness, on by proximity. And for instance, there is a study that tells us that the youth who were victimized, we are angry, and we are coping by using primary engagement, social support, aggressive strategies. When the youth who had witnessed the violence, we are fearful, focused on survival, and coped by avoidance strategies. So proximity and well, context of exposure plays role as well, not only the cumulative traumatization. So if we just keep that in our mind and recall the adverse childhood experiences. ACEs are the adverse childhood experiences by classical Felitti classification, 10 exposures that start at the age 0 until age 18. So our young people could be also exposed to the adverse childhood experiences. And we know that unfortunately, those who experience 4 and more adverse experiences, according to Felitti and Nanda and other researchers, are at significantly higher risk for social, psychological, behavioral health disorders. And not only that, we know that we know also the physical health outcomes, how they are suffering. And we also know that mortality rates are much higher in people who were exposed during their childhood and adolescenthood to adverse childhood experiences like neglect, like abuse, like being a member of the dysfunctional family. And WHO added additional adverse childhood experience, collective violence, like war. So when we are screening persons with who address our clinics, we are asking also about the war experiences, because the collective violence is the war, like, for instance, the war in 2014, 2015 in Ukraine. So adolescent age, cumulative trauma, COVID trauma, and adverse childhood experiences that might be brought to young people during the last Ukrainian war already gives us the picture that we should be alert. Yeah. As for the prolonged trauma, because now 4 months The war started 4 months ago. This is really prolonged trauma, prolonged severe trauma that affects development, affects all contexts of the young person, affects neurodevelopmental, social, emotional, well, all domains of the development and the life environment and things. And for instance, Samara and her team tells us that effects are likely to persist into adulthood even after violence stops, and we need to be very well equipped to stop those effects, that impact. Please consider that youth who might be in the safe place are still exposed to the war experiences through the media. Actually, this is the social media war. This is the first time that the war is called that name. And actually, young people who are much more proficient in social media things are watching the war actually 24/7. So this is prolonged exposure. And if we consider also the daily stressors, and there are researches that show that daily stressors are very important threats for mental well-being. Yeah. So not only the distress arises solely not from war experiences, not only for war exposure, but now we are shifting the focus towards the role of post-conflict environment, post-conflict stressors, because they really mediate the adjustment process and mediate the clinical outcomes. And we know that, for instance, we know that many young people experience ongoing daily stressors, even if they are in this secure and safe place like the Netherlands. So why should we be watchful and careful? Because we should consider age specifics, sorry for misspelling. We should consider the cumulative trauma experiences, past trauma, past war, post-war difficulties, ongoing one, COVID-19 impact, daily stressors. So all these unfortunately, all this creates pretty. Well, I should not use this word, but well, it is difficult situation with Ukrainian youth, unfortunately, and we should be aware. We should be watchful how they are doing. We should be careful what are we offering to them. We should be really not pathologizing them, because we know that reactions to the trauma really differ. And let me show you the Renos Papadopoulos trauma grid that tells us that yes, the reactions to the traumatic exposure could be negative, starting from ordinary human suffering, coming to distressful psychological reactions, and also to psychiatric disorders like PTSD. But they could be neutral, like resilient response to the trauma when a young person has enough strengths and enough well, biological, social support, coping strategies, and so on and so forth to withstand the experience. But also we know and we value that a lot of people could experience positive outcomes. Like Renos calls it adversity activated development, AAD, but we call it post-traumatic growth, don't we? So this is the positive psychological change through difficulties experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. And we know that these positive changes are manifested in 5 broad domains, like new appreciation of the life. So you are finding the new meaning in your reality, new possibilities when you are seeing challenges like possibilities, spiritual change. I have seen a lot of persons with a changed spiritual attitude, close relationship. We know that trauma robs us of intimacy, and with traumatic growth we could enjoy the intimacy, deep close relationships with our dear ones, with our friends, and so on and so forth, and personal strength, the feeling of personal power, feeling of strongness. And thanks God that this is reality and not just a theoretical concept. So how we work to overcome this the severe trauma sequel and go towards the hope and strengthening and growth. First of all, we work as a multidisciplinary team because we are based on the biopsychosocial model of care. So we are psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, social workers, occupational therapists, general practitioners, art therapies, and so on and so forth. So the team is kind of client, person-centered. So whatever needs are additional person could enter the team, like neurologist or dance therapist. Yeah. What are the principles of the work of our work? We try to build resilience by practicing assertiveness, by practicing problem solving, by practicing team spirit, and so on and so forth. We are trying to activate adaptive coping strategies, both in the domains of belief or imagination, emotions, cognition, social field, and so on and so forth. We are trying to follow up the young people on their trajectories of the development. For instance, if the person enjoyed our support for 4 months and the course is finished, we don't dismiss and we don't discharge the person without follow-up. And after 3 months, we are trying to contact and see how she or he is. And also, we know that if the person is highly traumatized, for instance, has 4 and more adverse childhood experiences, and was exposed to the war or some other traumas, we offer them to come back when they are experiencing additional problems during their life trajectory. So we are following them, and they know that they could come back and get, for instance, 1 session or again 12 sessions or even longer because we know that one-time intervention, even if it's long, for instance, again, 4 months long intervention, is not enough because of these age turbulences and a lot of challenges that the person face, interpersonal, study-related, work-related, even location related, because this time is the mobile time. Young people move a lot.
And Nina, is
Yes.
it difficult to reach the adolescents, I think, particularly? Because I can imagine that they some are not willing to join a program and they just want to be left alone, or maybe avoidance. How do you convince them that it's good for them?
Yeah, the thing is that yeah, you're right, and thank you for this comment. The thing is that at this in this era, even if mental health is still pretty stigmatized field, and we are also stigmatized and self-stigmatizing, I think. This age now kind of recognize the problems. So a lot of people are seeking help, and we know that help seeking pretty strongly is associated with recovery, with well-being, because if you're knocking, the door is opening. Yeah. So people are help seeking, and nowadays we are offering mostly online sessions. So they are pretty comfortable with online. We are not that comfortable, but they are very comfortable with online counseling. And also what we see is that that this is word of mouth, I think. So a lot of people have their closed social media groups. So they announce, yeah. So even we could get some glimpses of disclosure in those closed groups, that this helped, and please, if you experience this, approach the service or the counselor. So of course, we know that there are a lot of people who are left without attention, but we are offering even text counseling, because some young people are not able to call because of circumstances. They could not talk. And if anybody got the counseling via texting, you know how hard it is. So, but we offered it as well.
So not on a fixed text, but you mean like you're texting together?
Yes, we are texting together.
Okay.
Yes, this is the texting session.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
So, so we're considering, of course, risk and protective factors. We are offering needs-based support, and of course, trauma-informed and trauma-focused care. Trauma-informed care is trauma-sensitive care, and trauma-focused intervention is the intervention that the person already has PTSD or complex PTSD and needs evidence-based advanced intervention like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. We are very, very happy with the transdiagnostic interventions. These interventions aim to strengthen children, young people, coping strategies, resilience, life skills, and also they are learning how to manage their symptoms. There are a lot of trauma-informed programs that are showing promising results. For instance, we just published a paper about our service our transdiagnostic approach, like emotional regulation module, social competence module. There are also mind-body practices that are showing effectiveness, like mindfulness, yoga, dance, breathing, guided imagination, or just imaginary, and also self-expression techniques like via narratives or drawings or of movement. Creative interventions, we use them with young people, like drama and music, because they help build better relationship, better interpersonal kind of competencies, and so on and so forth. And we are also exploring the sports activity, because there are researches that show that kind of hypothesize, and also there are some emerging evidences that engaging in sport also is helping youth, facilitating positive relationship with adults and peers, competence building, confidence building, kind of creating the goal-oriented environment, and so forth. So we are exploring that domain as well. As for the individual and group-based treatments, evidence-based treatments, of course, trauma-focused CBT is the one that we utilize, and a lot of CBT-based approach for depression or for anxiety as well, or addiction. We are also offering EMDR, eye movement desensitization therapy. I think I'm tired. There are also therapies that proved to be effective in young people, like narrative exposure therapy, the kids version, and like SETA, common elements treatment approach, that proved to be effective in kids, but also in young people and also in adults across the Ukraine. Of course, there are a lot of challenges and gaps. For instance, realities of work in often chaotic humanitarian settings. If we are talking about the refugees in the Netherlands, do not really support very structured mental health care and mental health care system development in this chaotic context. But there are also some other challenges, like we mentioned stigma, like language barriers, like perhaps lack of professional resources, like disrupted social context, like school, education, university, and also family. Perhaps the father is in the war and or the brother or some other relatives, like is the case, for instance, with Ukrainians living in Georgia, for instance. Ongoing crisis with uncertainties and confusion. And we know that this crisis kind of calls people back. A lot of people are going back to Ukraine. I don't know exact numbers, but myself, I saw my colleagues, but also some other people who were staying in Tbilisi and Batumi, going back to Ukraine, to the war situation. Because, for instance, some of them told me that we are safe here, but we don't feel the safety because our relatives, our dear ones are there and they are fighting. So better to be there than here. So there is a huge confusion going on, alas. We are also seeing the over-medicalizing, over-psychologizing, over-pathologizing attitude versus strengthening approach. And we are also seeing that interventions that are offered might not be effective. So there is the lack of ensuring of the quality of support. Yeah. So in this slide, actually, this is the last one. I'm going back to the staging model, and take-home messages are just the voices of the model, putting resources into promotion and prevention to intercept, slow down, reduce the impact of the trauma exposure. Please, let's try early identification and intervention with transdiagnostic methods while the condition is subsyndromal, subthreshold, not clinical. When the condition is clinical, then let's try evidence-based treatments, and let's be recovery and hope oriented, because hope is really the strength that is needed, especially in young age. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nino. This was really interesting. Wow. And also, I also think about all the youth, because a lot of youth are still in Ukraine and try to fight and are in the middle of the youth. So I was also thinking, wow, in the upcoming years, what will happen with them? Especially when you mentioned that people after 20 years develop depression. So maybe we don't know either if there is a correlation between the war experience and depression, because it was not clear in my head that you can make the link between that period in the past and the present depression. So that's good to mention for all of us, that yes, when people deal with war or related to war situation, it's really have a big impact.
Wendy, thank you for this comment. Yeah, let's. I will try to make 2 points. if I not forget, one is that everything is disrupted. Schools, universities, especially in the east of Ukraine. For instance, in Kharkiv now, my colleague started to work in the university, but the education system is not there yet. So a lot of processes are disrupted. They were disrupted during the COVID era, but somehow we adapted, and COVID is not the war. Yeah, so development is disrupted, emotional, interpersonal, even cognitive development is not there. So there is the revenge, there is the enemy image, there is the well, what is called the toxic stress around young people that really affect them. As for how far we could prognose, we don't know. Like those trajectories. Now I regret that I removed that slide. Like those trajectories, you don't know. You don't know when the late onset PTSD will start. After 5 years, who knows? We don't know whether person who suffers now recovers naturally without any support. And we don't know whether the person who is now strong gets depressed and then gets better and then gets again, because what we know is that PTSD is highly comorbid. So war trauma gets a lot of so bunch of disorders together. So we have addiction, we have complex PTSD, we have personality changes. So a lot of things are happening, but still we lack the cohort studies to be sure that trauma exposure is the thing that affected my mental well-being after 20 years. Because we could not, mostly these studies are cross-sectional, so we could not show the cause and consequence. We just see that there is the association, but what happened between exposure and those outcomes? So these soldiers who were doing a lot of bad things, and bad things were happening to them, and 17 years after, what happened during this timeline? What were these threats, and what were these life stressors, and how was the social support, and what? So a lot of other variables are coming in, but still we should be careful, because we see a lot of cumulative trauma in Ukrainian youth.
Yeah, and also the when I spoke to Ukrainian people, they are very angry about what happened, and that's also another, that aggression part is also difficult, because when you are traumatized, but you also have a lot of aggression, that's also difficult to deal. But how you can manage all your aggression?
Yeah.
Is that also to the connection to the sport you mentioned? That will be very good to have physical activities to have the use of that emotional. I can imagine it will be very helpful.
When you're mentioning this, those feelings, I should really emphasize what we see in Ukraine, what we saw in Ukraine in 2014, 2015, and afterward. This is the cohesion that is, well, I think everybody sees that, the cohesion of the nation. So this is the huge kind of social support that the people have there. So they have a lot of volunteers. People just volunteer their money, their time, their energy, their knowledge, their expertise. Well, this is well, I'm but I could not find another word. This is beautiful to observe this spirit. Because this is at this stage, this cohesion, I think is the protective factor against mental health problems. But on the other hand, when we really see that symptomatology of the people who address hotlines and services and express their problems, the symptomatology is heavy, very heavy.
So something happened to my connection, I think, because I can't see you anymore. Do you see me?
We hear you, but we don't see you, Esther.
Okay, I can't see you anymore, but okay, you can see me.
No, we don't see you. We hear you.
No,
yeah, it's okay.
It's okay.
Well, Nina, I just want to mention that I think your presentation is very clear to all of us, very helpful as well. There are not many questions afterwards, but I got a question in advance. And this was, you already mentioned it, that it's very important to know if it's like a psychological disorder, if you really need to do treatment, or you should be aware with that and you should focus on resilience. And you also mentioned that it's hard to know when this late onset PTSD will start. And I got a question from someone who asked, like, should we try to let young people talk about current life?
I don't.
Oh, there you
Now
are.
I see you.
Yeah.
But your voice was not clear. I did not get. I did not hear the question. I'm sorry.
I repeat it, and I'll try to make it shorter.
Yes.
Should you try to stimulate young people to talk about what happened, to be sure if they are traumatized and they need more help, or should you just let it over to them, and if they don't want to talk about it and they want to focus on school or friends, you should just let them go? Or how do you know if it's severe trauma underneath?
Yeah. We are assuming, and we are when we are trying to assess the situation, we're looking beyond the symptomatology. Sometimes the person does not disclose the trauma, and then we are okay with that. So we see the symptomatology, and we see the past history, and we see the ongoing stressors, and we try to support and strengthen the person. And if she or he does not want to talk, we let it be, because sometimes, in my experience, for instance, the person shared the huge trauma after 2 years of enjoying the service. Because the trauma destroys the trust, not only in oneself, but in the outer reality. And even if the person comes and we have the good rapport, and this is the good working relationship, and the things are progressing okay, nicely, it does not mean that there are no secrets and there are no gaps in your assessment, and that you know everything about the person. So we tolerate that. So we formulate and conceptualize the situation according to the data that we have, and try to give, for instance, autonomy, control, and trust, and to get the person to reflect that in these present moments.
And one more question about family. Should you always invite family members to the therapy of young people, you think? Or if they are traumatized themselves, should you not do that? Or
very, very good question. Thank you, because when I prepared the presentation, and then I reviewed, but I did not have the time to add. Family-oriented approaches are very, very important, both with kids and with young people. So we always try to involve somebody. Of course, if the family member is not the perpetrator, and you know that it happens, even then we try to involve the person, for instance, mother, father, grandmother, or sister, or whoever, but with different counselors. So this is not the family counseling. This is separate streams of working. But you are right. We try to be family oriented, because we know that trauma destroys relationships. Trauma isolates. So if we want to revive relationships, then we should work with family members. Sometimes we are even working with close friends.
And you also mentioned in the presentation you just published article. Can you tell us a little bit about the intervention of that article?
Yep. The paper is published about the club synergy that is our service. multidisciplinary service and trauma-informed service, though we are providing trauma-focused interventions as well. The service is intended for people 14-25, so young people, we call them youth, young people, and we offer the transdiagnostic modules for the symptomatology that are common in many conditions. For instance, emotional disbalance, for instance, stress management, for instance, resilience buildings, and so on and so forth. And advanced interventions for comorbidities and for trauma, for instance. We are, unfortunately, more than 70% of our clients have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. So we know that we should be trauma sensitive and trauma informed. That it means that we pay attention to those experiences, even if we do not try the methods when you are confronting the trauma. If I'm clear in my speech.
Yeah.
So we are prolonging some therapies to address this disbalanced equilibrium.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. Yeah.
Wow, that's nice. There are not so much questions.
And psychosomatologists and some other specialists in the teams.
So when we are searching for your name, then maybe we found that article.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, that's good. There are not many questions in the chat. I have no question. Maybe, do you have any question, Esther? It's not on mute, still on mute. You have to unmute.
Verbally, she tells us.
I'm sorry. No, I just want to thank you very much, Nino, for all the efforts and for making this time for us, because we know you are very busy doing your wonderful job. So thank you for sharing all your knowledge and expertise. It was a very clear presentation and very important for us.
Thank you for doing that. Thank you for those webinars. Perhaps indeed, they would help somebody.